Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about Scream 5. Let's get into it. Scream 5 is a 2022 film starring Neve Campbell, Melissa Barrera, Jenna Ortega, and is directed by Tyler Gillette and Matt Bettinelli-Olpin. 25 years after a streak of brutal murders shocked the quiet town of Woodsboro, California, a new killer dons the Ghostface mask and begins targeting a group of teenagers to resurrect secrets from the town's deadly past. So, in true Scream fashion, this film begins with a cold open of a recognizable actor or character getting a call from Ghostface. This time it's Jenna Ortega. But, unlike previous installments, this film does a fake out and the victim actually survives. I was a fan of this creative choice personally. It subverts expectations and it's a subtle way to let the audience know that this movie is doing its own thing. And while I didn't feel like it was necessarily successful at doing that throughout the rest of the movie, I still appreciate what they did and what they were trying to do. I see what they were going for, and I think it was executed good, at least in this opening. It was a nice return to form. When you think of Scream, or at least when I think of a Scream film, the three main things I associate these movies with are the self-aware commentary on the landscape of horror that the movies offer, the phone calls with Roger Jackson, and that opening scene, which is an extension of the phone calls. All three of these things are literally embedded into the DNA of these films and are essential in making a good Scream movie. And if one of these things is a little weak, you want to make sure that the other two are strong enough to help make up for it. As much as I loved Scream 4, I think the movie as a whole is held back just a little because of its opening. Wes Craven tried to do something different with that opening as well, but I thought it was an odd creative choice that just didn't work for me personally, whereas this one stayed familiar enough that it still felt like a strong Scream opening that could contend with the best of them, but did just enough to stand on its own as well. But aside from Roger Jackson knocking it out of the park as usual as Ghostface, I think the thing that works the best in this opening scene is Jenna Ortega herself. I think she probably has the most believable performance of any character in any of these openings since probably Casey Becker in the first film. Drew Barrymore was so convincing in that first movie. You felt like you were watching these events actually unfold, and that's what Jenna Ortega accomplishes here, I think. She almost deserved an Oscar for this, if you ask me, and at one point, she's screaming and begging for Ghostface to just leave her alone, and it's such a bone-chilling moment. And it's all thanks to Jenna's performance. The way she conveys her fear here on screen is just so effective. But I actually don't think there's a bad performance in this movie. Not a single one. I mean, obviously certain characters are stronger than others, but none of them just take you out of the movie or are just so egregious that you hate yourself for watching them. And it seems like everybody in this movie really came to play, like they were all genuinely excited and passionate about making this movie. As an audience member, those are my favorite films to watch, the ones where you can tell that the people involved with making the film weren't just doing it for a paycheck or to cash in on a popular franchise and are actually fans themselves because it translates well to screen, and this movie truly was a labor of love. It may not have been directed by Wes Craven, but it had his essence all over it. And I actually think he would have been pretty satisfied with where they took his story. Is it a perfect movie? No, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this video, but it is a good movie, and it's a solid return. And I think that's all Radio Silence was really going for here. I don't think they were reaching for the stars, as I've said in other videos actually. I think for this movie, more than anything, their main goal here was just to establish themselves. This isn't like other franchises in horror that have had many different directors and writers and timelines and different characters every other movie. This was Wes Craven from start to finish and mostly Kevin Williamson. It's had a pretty streamlined continuity, and let's face it, there were some pretty big shoes to fill here. So I don't think Radio Silence wanted to experiment too much with this movie. They just wanted to prove to the fans that their franchise was in good hands and that they could make a competent movie that respected the source material and just prove themselves before they went and tried anything new or experimental. And I would say they pretty much succeeded in doing that. At least for me anyways, I walked out of this movie wholly satisfied. And I think we got the second most vicious Ghostface in this movie. A lot of people would say the most vicious. especially because of one scene in particular where a guy gets stabbed in his neck. It is pretty brutal, I'll admit. Like, as you're watching it, you're really not sure what Ghostface is going to do. And me, anyways, I was actually clenched up and like anticipating something much worse to happen than what actually happened. But because of the anticipation alone, I think the scene was very effective. And even what we got was still very brutal. But I still contend that Scream 4 is the most brutal movie in this franchise, and that was the most vicious Ghostface we've gotten. But this movie is definitely a close second. But another thing I praise not only this movie for, but even Radio Silence for, is that they are taking these movies in a different direction. I mean, even Scream 5, while it is formulaic to the Scream template, it still introduced new characters and made the plot focus around them. Yeah, we got our legacy characters, but they were basically just the cherry on top. They were just a bonus. The movie didn't depend on them to propel the plot forward, and I like that. I respect Radio Silence for writing actual characters with actual motivations and having enough faith in them to carry this movie, and are continuing to have faith in them to carry the next movie, and possibly the next movie if there's a trilogy, which I'm not actually sure if they are doing a trilogy. That may be common knowledge, and I just don't know because, like I said, I don't keep my finger on the pulse of this community, so that's actually something I'm curious about. If somebody knows that answer, go ahead and leave it down in the comments section. That would rock. But I'm really on board with what these guys are doing. I loved Ready or Not, so based on that alone, I already knew that this was probably going to be a good movie regardless. Even if it wasn't necessarily a good Scream movie, I knew that as a standalone film, it was probably going to technically be a good film. But the fact that we did get a good Scream movie was just so freaking awesome to me. And I would have never thought, like, I was one of those people who you would have never convinced that another person could take the Scream franchise and do something great with it. But Radio Silence proves me wrong, and I'm happy they did. But unfortunately, just like most movies, this movie does have its problems, so jumping right into the negatives now. And the first big one is how they killed Dewey. Not that they killed Dewey, but how. From the very beginning of us hearing we were getting another Scream movie, I was championing the idea of them killing off one of the legacy characters, so I was completely on board with that. And not because I think any of them suck, because in fact, they're all great, memorable characters. I mean, they're the reason, or at least most of the reason, we love this franchise so much. But because this movie needed to take a risk and establish itself to a new era of fans, one big problem I have with all the Scream movies as a whole is that there's no real tension, because by part 4 you pretty much went into every movie knowing your core cast was going to survive. They killed off Randy in part 2, but I guess they didn't like the backlash they got from that, so Wes Craven was like, nope, never again. But I think it needed to happen to give a real sense of tension back to the movies to show that nobody is safe. But I digress. My problem, again, is how they killed him. First of all, the death was very unceremonious. It did not feel like a hero's death at all, and it needed to, because this is freaking Dewey. And secondly, I don't like that he basically got killed because he's a dipstick. He only died because he checked his cell phone, and I feel like it cheapens the moment. And I'm not a writer or a director, so don't get me wrong, I get it. I know that making a movie is hard, so I don't have the answer. I don't know exactly how I think it even should have played out, but I just didn't like what we got. But then my next negative is the killer reveal. I definitely liked it better than the killer reveals of Scream 2, because at least there were breadcrumbs leading up to these two being the killers, and the killers did have actual interactions with our main cast, so it felt earned, unlike Scream 3. So when they were finally revealed, it made sense, but compared to some of the other films, it was still very weak, and as I'm watching it unfold, I'm like, well, duh. Of course it's those two. I mean, who else would it be? I'm not sure if anybody else felt like that when they watched it play out, but to me it was so obvious, and not in a good way. The first Scream was obvious, but that movie also perfected the art of hiding the killer in plain sight. I think this movie tried to do that, even going as far as Dewey flat out suspecting one of the killers right out the gate and calling them on it. But it was just so on the nose that it didn't feel earned. But that's really it, guys. Anything else I have to say is just more of a nitpick. I think this movie sits comfortably among the better films of this franchise, and for a rating, I'm giving it an 8.5. But anyways, that's it for this one, guys. What did you think of Scream 5? Did you agree or disagree with anything I said? Go ahead and let me know down in the comments section, or find me on one of my socials, which are in the video descriptions of all my videos. In the meantime, go ahead and like and share this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.